Hi, everybody. My name's Dan Ward, and I'm the author of Lift, Innovation Lessons from Flying Machines That Almost Worked and the People Who Nearly Flew Them. Today I'm going to talk about experimentation, risk-taking, and failure, three of the main themes in my latest book. Let me begin by introducing one of the main characters in the first chapter of Lift, a gentleman named Octave Chanute. He was a civil engineer in the late 1800s, working on railroads at a time when they were the cutting-edge technology in the world. He wrote a book titled Progress in Flying Machines in 1894, 9 years before the Wrights had their first flight. We're actually going to talk about his book more than mine. He documented 400 years of failed flying experiments. And again, this is at a point in time when nobody had ever flown anything yet. Chanute collected, summarized, and analyzed stories of really every experiment that anyone had ever done in this area. His book is full of these gorgeous line drawings of flying machines like these, and I can't emphasize this enough, none of them were successful solutions to the problem of flight. But each one did have something to teach us. Each one helped advance the field of aviation in some way, sometimes by showing us what not to do. I could tell you the story about each of these, what was special and what we can learn from each one and what was wrong with each one, but that would take all day, so you'll have to read his book. The point is, these people were doing something truly remarkable. They were trying to solve a problem that had never been solved before. I couldn't put his book down. In his introduction, he describes three main goals for his book: to determine whether human flight is possible, to identify the dead ends, and then to identify the most promising paths. So for his first goal, he correctly determined that, yes, flight was at least theoretically possible. For his second goal, he correctly identified dead ends like gluing feathers to your wings and building flapping wings. Yeah, we can stop doing those. Now, here's an example of one of those dead end approaches. The description there shows that he, in 1809, almost 100 years before the Wrights came along, supposedly flew to a height of 54 feet off the ground by beating his wings rapidly. That might sound like a pretty successful device, but then we learn one extra bit of kind of important information. Chanute writes, these descriptions failed to mention one important addition. Degan was also attached to a small balloon capable of raising 90 pounds. 90 pounds? That's not a small balloon. So no, he wasn't flapping his wings successfully. He was dangling from a balloon. That's the sort of thing you discover when you go beyond the headlines and actually do a little research, which Chanute did. Now, for his third goal, he correctly determined that curved wings produce more lift than flat wings. This was a question of significant debate in his day. Now, as you might guess, some of the curves in this figure performed better than others, and some were actually worse than a perfectly flat wing. Again, this is the sort of thing we only learn when we go beyond a superficial analysis. All the advocates of flat wings were flat wrong, but that's because they were comparing flat surfaces with bad examples of curved wings, like number 6 there, rather than good curves like number 2, which is actually pretty close to a modern airfoil shape. Chanute was very clear about the attributes he prized most. People who did an iterative series of physical experiments got much more praise than those who made hypothetical drawings. He dismissed big, expensive, complicated approaches, much preferring the smaller, more focused experiments that chipped away at the big problem one small bite at a time. And the people who worked well with others and who shared their results of their work, their designs, their data, those are the ones who got the highest praise from Chanute in his analysis. This is a great example for us today. No matter what your domain, no matter what area you're working in, these three things are the key to making progress. Lawrence Hargrave did all of that, and he's the topic of chapter 5 in my book. We see him here with a box kite that he designed. It was a simple, inexpensive, very robust, and capable of lifting a person off the ground. He used these kites to experimentally answer the question about flat versus curved wings. He showed that curved surfaces produce more lift. He also patented nothing. He published all of his data openly to help advance the field. And so Chanute wrote about him saying, if there is one man more than another who deserves to succeed in flying through the air, that man is Mr. Lawrence Hargrave. High praise indeed. So inspired by Hargrave, one of my early COVID projects was to design and build a box kite of my own, just out of wooden dowels, some wire, and some plastic sheeting. When I flew this thing, it pulled so hard it almost ripped my arm off. Man, these box kites really generate a lot of lift. Very fun project. Highly recommend monkeying around with something like that if you get a chance. So as Chanute assembled this big list of all the things that had not succeeded quite yet, he discovered this important truth about failure. It's never the whole story. So lesson number one from Chanute is simply this: study failure. Studying failure is one of the keys to solving hard problems. Easier said than done, I know, but fortunately, his example shows us how to do it and what it looks like. Of course, look, failure alone is a drag, but studying failure is transformative. All of those well-intentioned advisors who say we should just fail fast and fail often are kind of missing the whole point. And that is to study our failures and learn from them, to learn fast and learn often from our failures. The learning's the point, not the failure. Now, if the words study and failure fill you with a certain amount of dread, don't worry. Let's replace them with happier words like party and cake. One of the things my team does is we celebrate our failures with failure cakes. So this is an actual cake. I took this picture. My team and I ate this cake. And as we ate it, we discussed something we had tried to do that didn't turn out the way we had hoped. I actually don't remember the specific failure that led to this particular cake, but I very much remember the cake. In part, what we're trying to do here is destigmatize failure and turn it into a learning event. Sharing a cake together sort of takes some of the sting out, because cake is delicious, and it's a specific thing you can all do with your teams too. Now, obviously that's harder to do during social distancing, but we've also done some virtual, like, bring your own cake sessions, and we regularly send each other cupcakes in the mail. In fact, I think I was the most recent recipient of cupcakes in the mail for something I had tried to do that didn't work out. What an experience. What a delightful way to turn failure into a celebration and a learning opportunity. And of course, this current situation isn't going to last forever, so eventually we will get to sit around tables again and share failure cakes and use that as an opportunity to really discuss and learn and proceed. Now, whether you eat cake or not, here's 3 steps for how to study failure. Step 1, start by making a list of the things we've attempted that didn't work out yet. When we start making the list, we may discover it's a harder list to make than we think because we haven't really tried anything yet. You know, we've sat in meetings, we wrote some emails, we've done a lot of talking, but we haven't actually tried anything that constitutes a success or a failure. If that's the case, maybe write down "we failed to fail" and start trying some stuff. Start trying specific, concrete actions that produce results and aim to achieve specific goals or create specific effects. Do things that might theoretically be worthy of including in a failure list. Once you've got some stuff on that list, then the analysis can begin. That's step 2. Look for patterns, for similarities, for differences, and lessons. Then use that analysis to shape your next step, your next experiment, your next potential addition to the list from number 1. For example, Alberto Santos Dumont, who's the main character in chapter 3 of my book, built a series of airships. This layout is from a book titled A Dream of Flight. It's a kid's book, but I highly recommend it. I think every engineer should read A Dream of Flight. This layout on these 2 pages shows the iterative approach that Alberto took to his experiments. Each of his designs fixed a flaw from the previous version. They strengthened a weak point or provided some new function. See, the first few airships tended to crumple and crash pretty quickly. Eventually, he came up with a design that won some major prizes, and he even built a small personal airship he would use to travel from his apartment to a local cafe to have lunch and then fly home again. Amazing. The key to all of this is to do experiments. So let's break down this word experiments a little bit. The simplest form of an experiment is simply an intervention followed by an observation. So we're going to change something. We're going to introduce some new element or make a modification, take something away, some sort of intervention into the environment. Then we pay attention to what happens next. We collect some data. We reflect on it. That's what all of these people were doing in my book and in Chanute's book. They changed the curve of a wing, then measured how much lift it generated. They elongated their balloon, and when that crumpled, they tried a stubbier design. The key is to not just do one experiment, but to do a whole series. And this is one of my favorite lines in my book, Lift. I like it because it's actionable advice. Don't take risks. Do experiments. You see, telling someone to just go take risks is pretty vague. Go do experiments, that's specific. There is such a thing as the experimental method. And we can experiment with new technologies, new processes, new organizational structures, new communication methods. I once did an experiment with PowerPoint, or to be more accurate, without PowerPoint. I was the program manager for an airborne radar system, and I decided to see if I could go a month, just 1 month, without making or briefing any PowerPoint slides. Gang, I went a year, a full year, as the program manager of an $84 million radar system where I'd neither made nor briefed a single PowerPoint slide. I learned that it is possible to communicate effectively and lead a team without using PowerPoint. Nobody objected. I'm not sure anyone even really noticed. I just sort of did it. It was amazing, and I highly recommend trying that experiment yourself, but I digress. At some point, if you want to build an airplane, though, you're going to have to climb aboard and take the leap. So let's talk about risks. Really, if you want to do just about anything significant, you're going to face some risks. But there are good risks, and there are dumb risks. So this device from 1864 it's essentially a parachute, and it didn't work out very well for the experimenter, Monsieur de Groot. He jumped, he fell, he crashed, he died. Chanute points out in his analysis of this experiment that a few prior experiments with a bag of sand instead of a man on board would have exhibited the action that was to be expected. This is why I say do experiments rather than take risks. If our marching orders are to just go take some risks, then we might end up exposing ourselves to unnecessary and avoidable danger. If instead we set out to do experiments where our focus is on collecting data and on learning, then we'll be less tempted to act like a daredevil and just jump off the roof. We might find safer ways to generate the data we're looking for, the data we need. So do the experiment with a bag of sand. Then, if that works, by all means, climb on board. So while I don't like the recommendation to go take risks, I also reject the recommendation to stay safe. None of the people that I wrote about in Lift were playing it safe. The risks they took were breathtaking. I can scarcely imagine. For example, Chanute here in this glider is not that far off the ground, but he's far enough to break a leg, or worse. And he actually got even higher than this. Here's the thing. The risks that these people took were never the point. The experiment was the point. The learning was the point. And their experiments required a certain openness to risks. But it was a thoughtful approach, an incremental approach. Not playing it safe, but not pursuing risk for risk's sake either. Now, I want to say a few words about the selection criteria I used for my book. I was looking for people who built actual hardware before 1903, so before the problem of flight had been solved, and then people who wrote and published firsthand accounts of their experiments. So these are the 5 people I was able to find who did that, who met that criteria. Now you may have noticed they have one other thing in common. They're all men. See, the first woman to design and build an airplane was Gillian Todd in 1909, and she didn't publish anything, so she didn't fit the criteria. However, recently Kirsten Larson wrote an amazing book about Miss Todd's airplane. I highly recommend checking it out. But even though I didn't find any examples of women who built flying machines in the late 1800s and published firsthand accounts of their experiments, I did find a really interesting pattern that points to an important relationship between diversity and inclusion and innovation. The men who made the most progress are the ones who worked most closely with women. Their sisters, often their sisters and their mothers, other colleagues and friends. And so this is probably the most important line in my whole book. The people who made the most progress were the collaborators and bridge builders, the includers and inviters, the broad-minded generalists and disciplined blenders, and the people who had the hardest time were the isolated excluders. So the most effective experiments in the late 1800s, the most effective experimenters in the late 1800s, were the people who made a point to reach out to other inventors, who shared their ideas freely, who asked good questions, and who knew that building relationships with other human beings was just as important as building a stable flight surface. Collaboration with diverse partners, crossing the boundaries between different domains, cultivating strong leadership skills, strong teamwork skills, interpersonal skills like listening, empathy, grace and respect. These help make sure our experiments are informative, our risks are survivable, and our failures are delicious. So I'll leave you with this little summary. First, go do experiments. Think about what sort of change you can introduce and what sort of observation you can make. Then study failure. Make the list. And if there's nothing on your list, go do something that will produce a concrete result. Not a meeting, not an email, not a phone call. An experiment that might produce something, that might teach you something that maybe isn't what you were expecting. Do it even at the risk of failing. Finally, reach out to people. Reach out to people. Be inclusive and invitational. Embrace as many flavors and dimensions of diversity as you possibly can. Well, thanks again for dialing in and for attending this session. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was entertaining. Hope it was useful. You can find more information about my book Lift at thedanward.com/lift, to include links to find the paper version, the ebook version, and the audiobook version, as well as some free downloads, free excerpts you can download. Thanks again.